Good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Henry Fernandez, and I'm the chairman of the board of the Foreign Policy Association. It is my privilege to welcome you to our event tonight. It has already been quite a week for those of us in New York City. The UN General Assembly is meeting, so a large number of world leaders and foreign dignitaries are in town. In fact, the Foreign Policy Association held a terrific event with President Erdogan of Turkey on Monday evening. Beyond the UN activities, it is also New York Climate Week. My company, MSCI, used this opportunity to premiere our new documentary film, Net Zero Now, which explores all the ways that investors can help drive the low carbon transition. This morning, we also became a founding member of the Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance, committing to align our relevant products and services with a 2050 net zero emissions target. I mention all of these to underscore how passionate I feel about climate change, and therefore how very excited I am to introduce our guest this evening. Stuart McIntosh serves as executive director of the Group of 30, an economic and financial think tank comprised of central bankers, CEOs, academics, and other prominent global thought leaders. One Group of 30 member is my friend Mark Carney, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, who I met with earlier today, and I understand is also a source of inspiration and a lot of the ideas, some of the ideas that came out in your book, Stuart. Mark, as I said, has inspired many of us, including Stuart, with his leadership on climate change. Indeed, Stuart was inspired to write his new book, Climate Crisis Economics, after hearing Mark's 2015 climate speech to Lloyd's of London, and then working with him on a Group of 30 report titled Mainstreaming the Transition to a Net Zero Economy. Like Mark, Stuart understands climate science and climate policy and climate economics, a rare combination of various expertise. If you read his books, you will see that he's also a talented, engaging writer. Many years ago, he served as a speechwriter for the leader of the European Parliamentary Labour Party, Alan Donnelly. He also worked for former British Labour Party leader John Smith. So in addition to being a trained economist, Stuart knows how to communicate and how to explain complex issues, all of which is pretty well done in his new book. Stuart likes to say that he comes from a deeply pessimistic background, noting that his grandfather was a Calvinistic minister in the Scottish Highlands. But Stuart is also a very optimistic person, especially about our potential to reinvent the global economy and reach net zero emissions. The key word, of course, is potential. His book provides a roadmap for the net zero revolution, but it is not yet clear whether the world will follow it. Please do not be fooled by Stuart's accent. He is a dual citizen who has lived in the United States for 25 years, so therefore he understands not only his native country, but our own land. And he even has a cabin in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He often goes there on weekends where he enjoys biking in the Appalachian Mountains. What could be more American than that? So in all seriousness, I am sure everyone will learn a great deal about the climate challenge from reading your book, Stuart, and watching your presentation today. So without further ado, let me turn things over to you, Stuart.
Well, thank you so much, Henry, for such a kind introduction. Hold on, let me get this started. Hold on a second. Thank you so much, Henry, for such a kind introduction. It's a pleasure to join you, albeit virtually. And thank you to the Foreign Policy Association for hosting this event and asking me to speak about my book, Climate Crisis Economics. I want to speak today on getting to net zero, crises as crucibles for change. I want to say to you that we're in a race of tipping points. We must get to our own political, policy, and community narrative tipping point on the climate response very soon. Failure means risking hitting climate change tipping points of no return, driven by self-reinforcing feedback loops and systems that accelerate global temperatures and increases and herald a dystopian hothouse world. First, I want to say a few words about where we are today. Then I'm going to turn to the dangers of fat tails. I will draw some lessons from our past and COVID pandemic we can apply to the climate change challenge. I'll then look at what government leaders, businesses, and you and I can do to speed the green transition. So where are we now? CO2 in the atmosphere stands at 419 parts per million, a level not seen in more than 800,000 years. The latest IPCC report is a scream of alarm from the world's scientists. They warn dangerous weather events driven by climate change will increase in frequency and damaging intensity in the decades ahead. No prior IPCC report has been as striking or as damning. We would do well to listen and learn and act. We can all see they are right. Today, northern latitudes are warming much faster than the equatorial and some southern regions. The summer Arctic ice sheet is shrinking and will disappear in coming decades. Siberia is on fire. This summer, temperatures reached over 38 degrees Celsius and more than 30,000 square miles of tundra burnt, belching CO2 into the atmosphere. Europe baked, and Germany saw terrible flooding. And in America, 1 in 3 of us were affected by climate-related severe weather events. Wildfires in California and the Northwest scorched the landscape and polluted the skies. We have a severe multi-year drought in California, which has left levels in Lake Mead and Lake Powell at the lowest point in their history. 40 million people rely on the water of the Colorado, which is fed by snowmelt, and yet days of snowfall accumulation are shrinking as temperatures rise. No one thinks this is going to reverse. Hurricane Ida visited its devastation in New Orleans and death and destruction in New York and New Jersey. Or let's look overseas. Think of Bangladesh. The country was inundated by floodwaters, which covered 25% of its surface last year. 160 million people call Bangladesh home. All of these are examples of climate change related severe weather events. So what does the temperature outlook look like? The IPCC temperature scenarios fall into 3 buckets. First, there's a best case outcome where we secure something like 1.5 degrees Celsius. This scenario has a temperature range of 1.2 to 1.8 in the 2010 to 2040 period, rising to 1.3 to 2.2 degrees from 2041 to 2060. Second, there is a current commitment scenario. Here, the very likely range in temperatures range from 1.2 to 1.8 in 2010 to 2040, rising to 1.6 to 2.8 degrees Celsius from 2041 to 2060. And finally, there is the no action or failure scenario, where the very likely temperature increases run from 1.2 to 1.9 between 2010 to 2040 and 1.7 to 3 degrees C from 2041 to 2060. IPCC models make it clear that absent dramatic action by the leaders gathering in November in Glasgow for what is known as the Conference of Parties, COP26, we will end up at best in the second dangerous scenario. We will blow through Paris Agreement 1.5 Celsius target and risk triggering climate tipping points of no return. We have no time to waste. We need to be much more ambitious in our commitments and plans. For while history is written tomorrow, climate future is being made today. Now, most of us think that climate change happens slowly and gradually in a linear fashion. I know my friends and fellow economists think like that, but this is wrong-headed. Climate change happens slowly and then fast. It is non-linear, interconnected, dynamic, and only partly understood. Fat-tail dangers loom. Let me take a climate example from prehistory. The Younger Dryas era of 11,500 years ago. This was a period of rapid warming over a very short time frame. So just how short? Temperatures in Greenland jumped by a staggering 10 degrees Celsius in only a decade. The rest of the world warmed rapidly in just 30 years. This is climate change as slow and then fast. As a result, the rising seas submerged a landmass called Doggerland, the size of Netherlands, under the North Sea as the ice sheet receded and the seas rose up. Until then, my ancestors could have walked from Edinburgh to Oslo. So as we can see, climate change is not just about averages, but about extremes. Now, economists love averages, but they don't tell the real story. Today, looming fat-tail disasters are truly terrifying possibilities. Take, for instance, the Doomsday Glacier, the Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica. The glacier is the size of the United Kingdom and at least 1 mile high. The glacier is melting 8 times faster than a couple of decades ago. It is losing 80 billion tons of ice per year, and scientists worry about its stability. Were it to break up, global sea level would rise by 65 centimeters. But that's not all. Thwaites acts as a colossal stopper, halting ice flow from the interior of West Antarctica. Without Thwaites in place, ice would flow into the sea and break up, adding a further 3.5 meters to sea levels. All the world's coastal cities would be inundated. Now, we don't know just when that's going to happen. That's the nature of fat-tail risks. But we know that climate change systems are slow, then fast and sudden. Take, for instance, the Milne Ice Shelf in the Canadian Arctic, the last ice shelf in that part of the Arctic. Now, scientists knew it was unstable, and they were monitoring it, but they did not know if it faced imminent collapse. Yet collapse it did in only 2 days last year. So here again, nature shows us that climate change happens slowly until it happens fast. Now, my book lays out many of other dangerous fat-tail global tipping point nightmares, but I don't want to ruin your evening. Luckily for us, once recognized as such, climate crises are also crucibles of dramatic change. They shake up the existing order of things, often precipitating radical shifts in power, policy, and approaches. Take, for example, the Black Death, the bubonic plague that scoured Europe from 1346 to 1353. It ravaged the continent. Wave after wave of plague rose, was transmitted from rats to humans, spurring infection and an agonizing death. The plague spread by trade from the Eurasian steppes down the trade routes to devastate Florence and Siena and Venice, rushing onwards to London, to Bruges, to Paris and beyond. Cities were forced into lockdowns. Indeed, this is where our word quarantine comes from. The 40 days during which all citizens in the Italian city-states were confined to their homes to halt the plague. The Black Death killed at least 50 million people across Europe. Fully 50% of the population of England died. A severe labor shortage in Europe led to demands by the serfs and the laborers for much higher wages. The kings responded by outlawing wage increases, but that didn't succeed, and wages more than doubled in a short period, boosting the economic position of laborers and setting the stage for the growth of a new class of moderately well-off, increasingly skilled workers in Europe. The aristocrats lost, the surviving population gained. a consequential shift in the economic power began. Now, arguably, the disaster of the Black Death set the economic stage for the subsequent social and cultural revolution as the late Middle Ages gave way to the early Enlightenment and the birth of the modern world. Now, I think that the parallels with COVID are clear. In my book, I argue that there are positive lessons from this pandemic for our climate change response. Crises, once recognized, can be dynamic and transformative. Crises create windows of opportunity for sudden change. New political coalitions are created. Old ones are abandoned and thrown aside. What was previously considered impossible yesterday can become possible. The pandemic has shown us that countries' populations are willing to take huge steps, bear massive burdens when a crisis is properly understood and when the weight is shared fairly by all. The climate change response and transition are, today, the maximal challenge of our lifetimes. We only have a few years to ensure a stable climate future for future generations. Let us understand and recognize the climate change dangers. Let us take lessons from this pandemic about what can be done in extremis when all agree action is necessary and apply those to climate change solutions. But we must do so. As Ken Rogoff, professor of economics at Harvard, said to me, if we don't get this right, nothing else matters. We cannot avoid the climate crisis. We must confront it and seize the opportunity to manage a transition which will come either under a managed process or in a dangerous, disorderly one. Mark Carney, who Henry mentioned just earlier, and who is the special envoy on finance and for the COP26 process, said, you cannot self-isolate from climate change. So today, danger looms and time is of the essence. So let me now ask rhetorically and posit some answers to 3 questions. First, what should the leaders coming together this fall at COP26 in Glasgow do? Second, what should we as businesses and executives do? And third, what can you do as citizens and actors? What should leaders coming together this fall at COP26 do? First, COP26 leaders must set ambitious stretch targets for 2030 and beyond. All countries must commit to net zero, plan for it, benchmark it, implement short, medium, and long-term plans and market adjustments and reforms. Now, as many of you may know from your wives and partners, plans and to-do lists are action forcing. They may seem burdensome, but a plan is essential. Second, COP26 leaders need to harness the markets to the net zero task, use dynamics in the markets to support the transition. Enhanced transparency and disclosure are an important part of that. COP26 leaders should mandate that all large companies, public and private, disclose their carbon intensity according to common metrics, what is known as TCFD. Forcing all large firms to disclose their carbon intensity will allow investors to be better informed when they make decisions about where they will put their money. Firms that are going green will win the race for funding and see rising equity values. Losers and laggards will be punished by investors who will be increasingly unwilling to destroy the planet and to spoil our global commons. Requiring reporting and disclosure will change business strategies, goals, and planning. Markets can then act as an amplifier and speed the green shift. I know you, Henry, personally are doing a key job in supporting investor decision-making and their ability to select the green from the brown. COP needs to do its part to underpin this essential step in market transparency. Third, COP needs to agree the necessity for carbon pricing, support market expectations, indicate they expect prices to rise in the years ahead and converge. Let me be clear, carbon prices, whether taxes or cap and trade systems, or most likely a combination of both, must rise fast if we are to reach net zero by 2050. Central bankers estimate that carbon prices must rise to between $200 and $800 a ton by 2050. Now, currently, only a few states and regions are applying pricing at levels that are having an impact. Sweden, for instance, has a tax at $130 a ton. Canada has instituted a tax that will reach 170 Canadian dollars a ton by 2030. The EU cap and trade system is currently at 60 euros a ton, and the Californian cap and trade system has a price of $17.04. Now, some states have designed their systems, in the case of Canada and California, to pay back some or all of the carbon revenues to citizens, so they are relatively neutral. Others, such as Sweden, have reacted by cutting other taxes in compensation. Whatever the design used, countries must create mechanisms supported by regulation and effective oversight to internalize the cost of carbon pollution, and so correct market distortions and spur markets and firms into making the jump from brown to 50 shades of green. Fourth, COP26 must deliver on their $100 billion per annum commitment to lower income countries and support their green transition. This was made in 2015. Today, it remains an unfilled guarantee. It must be delivered upon. This is a small price to pay to ensure COP26 is a success. It's a tiny fraction of the 15 trillion spent on the pandemic. We can afford it. It's in the G20's interest to deliver and support the just transition. Now, what should businesses and executives do? All firms should design their own net zero business strategy, align business goals against it, measure against it, report on it, and reward achievements that move the firm to and beyond net zero. Net zero is a business necessity and an opportunity, as Henry said. It is the route to sustained profitability going forward. Consider what some of the leaders are doing and what the possible green future is beginning to look like. Scottish Power in my home country has shifted to 100% renewables for greening a nation. Today, its stock outperforms brown utilities. In Edinburgh, my utility carbon footprint is essentially zero. Scotland is powered by colossal wind turbines in the Highlands, power that is clean, green, and provides jobs and a strong income stream to rural communities. Or take Brewdog, a growing UK beer producer. The firm has a net zero plan and a net negative carbon footprint. Net negative brews and positive returns. I mean, I can drink to that, but I need something to go with the beer. I can opt for Walker's Crisp, whose circular business process provides a salty, crunchy option at the pub. But how do I get to the pub as, let's say, the designated driver? I might take a GM 1000 horsepowered Hummer, but perhaps that's inappropriate, too big, too much for British roads. Perhaps I take the Nissan Leaf, one of the best-selling EVs in the UK. Still a bit too large for you? Then I might jump into the Citroën Ami, a car so small you don't need a license and so cheap that after the down payment, my monthly cost would be the cost of a Netflix subscription. Perhaps I don't like that. Then maybe I buy the Hongguang Mini for $4,500, the best-selling EV in China. So I've been to the pub and I'm sated, but I need to think about investing sensibly for the green future. What do I do? BlackRock, Vanguard, and Henry can help me make my investments count. Let me say on BlackRock, Larry Fink has helped drive, along with you, Henry, the green governance revolution. Fink was not kidding around when he demanded change from company boards. The Exxon board now recognizes that. In fact, Larry Fink reminds me of a maths teacher of mine who was stern and hard but fair. My teacher would say when we whined and complained about our tasks, it's no that you couldn't, it's that you wouldn't. Often we won't do something. We need a leader, a teacher, a CEO, an investor, a regulator to help us get on and do it. My point in taking us down this brief Scottish stroll is to say that leaders and businesses are already constructing and reseeding the green tomorrow, that tomorrow can be better than today, sustainable, resilient, prosperous. Leading firms and CEOs are helping us to create that future now. They are pulling ahead as they align with investor ESG and climate change concerns, and that ESG wave is rising. Young investors want change and they are demanding it from their advisors. Young investors will receive the largest transfer of wealth in history, and they want investments that match their social and environmental concerns. Companies that want to be winners need to make the leap and lead on net zero to secure the backing from a greening class of investors. And those who greenwash and disguise the real conduct will be penalized. Courts too will play a role, as they have in the case of Shell and others. And I expect that type of governance case to become much more common. Company boards should be paying attention. Let me now turn to what you can do. Let me suggest 5 things. Change your power utility to a 100% renewable supplier. Consider putting solar PV on your house. Make your next car an EV. Just be careful. Keep away your teenager. The acceleration is too brutal and too addictive. You should fly less and perhaps more mindfully. And when you do fly, buy carbon offsets. And finally, we should all eat less meat and perhaps feel better. Most of us could do that. We would be healthier and the planet would be benefit from all that. So let me conclude. Climate change is the challenge of our lifetimes. Elon Musk can go to Mars when the feces hits the fan. The rest of us must live here. We can make the green transition. It can be managed, positive, and dynamic. We can construct green globalization 2.0. We all need to take responsibility and act now to achieve it. We have no time to lose. Let's get on with it. Thank you. Back to you, Henry.
Well, Stuart, thank you very much for those inspiring remarks and the summary of some of the key components of your fantastic book. And I especially like how you summarize the call to action between the governments, regulators, and other participants of COP26, the business leaders that obviously carry a great deal of the economic activity in a free market society, and obviously and importantly, the power of the individual, the power of the citizen that needs to do his or her part to contribute to this existential threat. And you know, I did early this year switch my car, my gasoline car to an electric vehicle, and you're absolutely right. The power of that accelerator is incredible. So we have to be, you know, we have to take advantage of it, but we have to be careful with that. So let me, you know, I have a lot of questions, but obviously in the time that we have, I'd like to focus on a few of them. I think the first one, and clearly the one that always garners a great deal of controversy and intensity of thought, is carbon pricing. And of course, you know, this is where the nationalist tendencies in terms of setting up carbon prices, whether it's for imports or the like, you know, can create havoc in global trade, as opposed to a global mechanism of carbon pricing. And clearly there is a lot of expectations for the Glasgow conference in November about coming up with some mechanism for a global scheme. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that, given how important this thing is. What are your expectations as to what can come out of Glasgow? You know, not only what should come out, but what will likely to come out based on what you know about the status of all these conversations going on.
Thanks, Henry. Well, let me maybe start with the, what I hope and expect to come out. I mean, I do think we will see an increasing number of announcements of stretch goals, additional steps being taken by major countries and companies such as yours in the run up to build pressure for the the overall agreement, but also the indication that really what this is about is more stretch goals. We can't just deliver on what we have committed to already. We need to stretch goal on the net zero target. Everybody must have a net zero target and plan and demonstrate they deliver against it. I would like to see some signaling on pricing, carbon pricing. Absolutely. We do need, I'd like to see a minimum and a commitment to a recognition of an upward trajectory for that pricing. However, I'm realistic that maybe Biden can't bear that at the moment. Ultimately, we need that for the reasons that you described and for economic reasons. We have to have better carbon pricing, higher carbon pricing over a long glide path in order to change the incentives in the marketplace and deliver the net zero goal we all seek. And we really need to press for that. I propose that ultimately, and it's not going to be part of COP26, but I believe in order to avoid basically a balkanization of the global trading system, that we need to, in the end, not yet, but I expect in the next few years, to create what I call the World Carbon Organization. Now, we have the World Trading Organization. They deal with all the trade rules, and it's been a massive success, as you know, Henry. But what we need to do now is to realize that, well, we have to have global carbon pricing in the medium term and in the long term. We don't want to have a beggar thy neighbor approach where some countries and sectors have high carbon pricing and others have none, and so there's incredible inefficiency, bad outcomes, and unfairness in trade. That will damage the trading system. Ultimately, we need a World Carbon Organization to essentially act as the technocratic quasi-judicial group that makes determinations about whether or not carbon pricing is being applied effectively. Now, I'm realistic. I don't expect that that's going to be created anytime soon. But what I would like to see, and I hope to see from COP, is a reaffirmation of the centrality of carbon pricing and rising carbon prices to this collective goal. Because if you look at the European environment at the moment, you've got a rising carbon price in the market because the markets are assuming that the politicians will deliver. They're assuming that there will be a higher carbon pricing going forward because that is necessary to achieve the net zero goal, and therefore policymakers have to adjust the levers. If COP26 doesn't do that and doesn't say, yes, prepare for higher carbon prices, then we get exactly the wrong signal. So I want that signal. I want higher stretch goals. I want commitment to monitoring and reporting as the absolute minimum. I know you're pressing for many of the aspects that are necessary from the business side, and you're demonstrating it yourself, Henry, in terms of how you're leading your firm and pressing businesses around you to change their behaviors to align with the net zero goal. And I applaud that. And that's got to continue into COP26 and afterwards.
Great. Thanks a lot for that. Clearly, no scheme in the world with respect to dealing with this threat is going to be successful with some internalizing of the cost of carbon emissions so that it gets reflected in the full value and the full cost of products and services in our society. So turning a little bit to the other concept that you have mentioned in your remarks and in your book about the timing of all of this, and the way I normally express it is that the great benefit of the Paris Agreement, COP21, was that it catalyzed the world to the target date of 2050, and the great curse of the Paris Agreement that it catalyzed it to 2050 because people thought that we have 30 years, to solve this problem. And in your remarks, with respect to what you want to see come out of COP26, is harnessing the power of markets, to achieve this. And as you know, markets are discounting mechanisms that are already taking into account the price of capital for companies that are carbonizing, and the reallocation of capital from carbonizing companies to decarbonizing ones. So maybe you can share more with the audience why this is not a 30-year period. Why a lot of this thing needs to happen now in the next few years, in the next 3 to 5, next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
And without that, we're going to be in serious difficulty.
It's an incredibly good point, and very important point, Henry, because we as people, as human beings, we tend to, well, if it's too far away, we don't do enough. We delay. And so it's incumbent on leaders in COP26, but business leaders, advisors, investors, and individuals to demand action, not in 2050, now. You have to start now. We have to front load. We should have loaded years ago, of course. Henry, you know that. If we had started 30 years ago, we would be much better off. The Swedes started taxing carbon 30 plus years ago. Their economy is now essentially net neutral. They have made the transition. They are where we all need to be. So we haven't done that. We have delayed, we have procrastinated, we've wasted our time. We have no time to waste now. As your own analysis, Henry, has shown, we really only have five to 7 years to achieve, or to begin to achieve the net zero goal we've proposed, and which all leaders are committed to under the Paris Agreement. So now is the time to front load, not to wait. And the way you do that is by making not just a long-term plan, but the plan has to be embedded inside each organization's strategy, measured on an annual basis and explained on an annual basis and adjusted. Because when you compress it to a 12-month focus, we all know we know what a 12-month focus is. So the workers can say, well, and the employees can say, I know what I have to do this year to move the ball down the field. I personally have to do these things. I don't have to carry the whole thing on my shoulders for the next 30 years, but I do have to do the following things this year. And then I will be measured against whether we achieved that. And that's why it's really, really important that we embed the net zero goals, not in a sort of, oh, it's far, far away kind of way, in annual appraisals, in training, in business strategies, in culture and conduct across businesses, across institutions, across sectors. So it actually requires huge, big steps by the businesses and by the leaders in order to sort of collectively make that shift, because it's when the leaders adjust the regulatory environment, then people can adjust. And they can plan for the carbon cost, and they can plan for the changes in construction standards, and so on and so forth. And that then allows the market, as you say, to be harnessed, to amplify and accelerate.
So Stuart, in the chat room here, there's been a lot of commentary about clearly actions by the Danish government, by the German governments, clearly by the Dutch government with respect to to Shell oil and the like. So what are your views as to the whether these actions by governments and courts of law that are trying to force the discussion about climate, they're trying to force the targeting of net zero, to companies and the like, do you see that spreading rapidly around the world, or you see that just a slow process at this point?
I'm not sure how fast it will spread, but it is very important because it's a signaling. It holds the board's feet to the fire, and it says this is not CSR. This is a core fiduciary duty of you as members of the board, and if the country has committed to X and it's legally required to pursue that, and you essentially have a social license to operate in that country as a major firm, and yet you don't have a plan. You're not applying a plan. You're polluting and destroying the future. That you're not being a board of directors. You're not being suitably responsible. So I expect those type of suits to increase, not necessarily across the world, but in major markets where those countries and governments have already committed legally and legislated for net zero targets. So if I was a British board of director member, I would be sweating. I would be asking my CEO, where is my net zero plan? Where is my net zero plan? Show me how you're achieving it, because I don't want to end up in the high court being sued because I've not carried out my fiduciary duties, and that could well happen.
I like the way you frame it, that it is it's a strong signal, it's a strong symbol of action, and even if it doesn't spread widely and fast throughout the world. Let's turn our attention to the topic that you brought up in your remarks, and that is the relationship between wealthy countries and less wealthy or more poor countries around the world, and the inequities that climate can create. As we all know, this net zero revolution will create a large number of winners and a large number of losers among companies, private or public, among countries, about sectors, even among individuals. So obviously, many politicians and governments are reluctant to effect many of the changes that need to take place for achieving net zero because of that effect on the less advantageous parts of society or countries. And we clearly have witnessed throughout decades and history the process of trying to retrain communities and societies where industries have died and they haven't been able to. It may take a few generations to transfer them to industries that are thriving. So how should we think about that process of that equity between either wealthy countries or poor countries, or within the poor parts of a developed market and the wealthier part? How do we bring everyone together in capitalizing on the opportunities and not being the victims of the losses that are going to occur here?
When we take the first piece, which is, let me first address the issue of, between rich countries and poor countries. We ought to support the transfers that are necessary. It should be at least 100 billion, which is what's already committed. I argue in my book that we should really be looking at 200 billion. Again, it's still a relatively small amount of money, a pittance compared to what advanced economies have spent during the pandemic. And much of that money could be generated and managed by the multilateral development banks. And so the real cost to the advanced economies would be less than that. And we can make sure that money is allocated appropriately and monitored and so on and so forth. But in doing that, it's a really good thing because our populations in the advanced economies are desperate for investable assets, desperate for options to invest in green, real investment opportunities, which also cut emissions. And so creating jobs and accelerating the transition, the rate of transition for those lesser developed countries by giving that type of coordinated transfer would actually pay us back anyway, because we would be the investors in those projects. So it's not that we're doing it for charitable reasons. We're doing it because we have to bring them with us and because we need to support their growth in order to be a future engine of growth for the world as a whole, and to avoid dystopian outcomes were we to leave them behind. Now, let me turn briefly to the issue of training in advanced economies. You're absolutely right that particularly in the United States, dislocation caused by other transformational sort of technological changes and shifts in industries and so on has not been dealt with properly. We had this trade adjustment assistance program, but it was essentially designed to be almost impossible to get any support from. So that the question of what do you do and how do you retrain workers in disadvantaged industries, which you want to close down anyway. You need to close down coal. You need to close down polluting industries that are extremely carbon intensive. The answer to that is it's education. So that's if you make community colleges free, that is an excellent way to get to that. You should also provide other educational and retraining opportunities. But I'm strongly of the belief as well that this process of transformation, this green transition that we are going through, either in a managed way or a more disorganized way, will drive our economies in the decades ahead. And the type of jobs that will come out of that process are not the same as the IT revolution, for instance. I mean, creating an app does not create meaningful, productive work in West Virginia or in Tennessee or in Texas. But building wind farms or solar or the necessary industrial shift that we're talking about, that does. I would note, for instance, that the two states with the largest amount of wind power are not in blue democratic states. No, it's Texas and it's Kansas. And it's real jobs, real income, real development. So I see this opportunity to recast our economies as one that can actually be more equitable than the current paradigm that we have been living in. Henry.
Migration. This is clearly potentially, Stuart, one of the biggest threats in the inabilities of countries to tackle, climate change, because when you have large, migration flows of a great number of people from one country to another or from one region to another, that creates all sorts of fears and distribution of water resources and land and housing and all of that. So you address the threat of all of this in your book. Can you give us a sense of, where would those come from, in what areas, and how soon could that start? Going back to the issue of timing, and what disruptions can that create?
Well, Henry, you're pushing me back into my pessimistic Scottish Calvinist stance, because this is one of the many nightmares that we confront. The World Bank just a couple of weeks ago issued its latest update to its forecast for refugee flows, and they estimated that that climate change driven internal refugee migration would amount to 219 million people over the next decades into 2100. Now, being the World Bank, they say internal migration, but of course we know that that's not actually what happens. What happens is if I'm farming in northern India, and the temperature simply gets too hot, which is what is forecast, that oftentimes, if I walk outside, and of course because most of the workers are agricultural, if I walk outside during the day, and even if I stand in the shade, I will die. It's going to be so hot that I will die. I'm not going to just move internally and say, well, I'll just move down the road a bit. No, I may have to say, well, the game is up. I'm out of here. I'm going somewhere else. And this is the case. This will be the case in parts of Africa as well, because they're suffering from huge amounts of stress from the increased heat. It may be the case in parts of South America as well. And so this comes back to things we were discussing earlier. It is in our own vested interests to address these issues of equity and reinvestment, in not just in the advanced world, but in the emerging world as well. Because if we fail to do that, and if we fail to address climate change, the emergency immediately, 10, 20 years from now, the refugee flows we will see then will dwarf anything we have previously seen. And oh my God, the disaster that will unfold then in terms of state stability and in those countries, but also in our own state. So I'm with you. I don't have an answer, but I agree with you that this is incredibly urgent. What we saw into 2010, 2015, and what we still see to a degree in Europe now over the Mediterranean, this is small beer compared to what will happen in the future if we don't make North Africa more prosperous and more stable.
So let me turn to a final question and to try to turn from the Calvinistic approach to a little more hopeful approach. Clearly, a lot in your books, you explain some of the threats and some of the difficulties, but you also have recognized that and have spoken about how scaring people into the risks is not going to motivate them, and it's not going to be the answer. So therefore, I think in focusing on what are the things that are going right, what are the things that are giving us hope that the world is addressing some of these issues. So what in your mind are some specific countries or industries or sectors or individuals that you see progress being made that are beacon of hope that we will be, we as a race can start dealing with these issues in a short order?
Wow, that's a very important question. Many different ways of dicing it, Henry. But let me say, one of the things I argue for in my book, and that I think I really believe, and you can see it operating in other countries, including my home country of Scotland, is that we need to localize the conversation about climate change, because in the end, that climate change affects you in your community, in your town, in your city, in your where you live. That's where it becomes tangible and real. That's where the hurricane hits. That's where the drought occurs. And so by localizing the conversation, you can move things forward in a really much more productive way, because you sit around with oftentimes this is what happened in Scotland. You have facilitated what they call big climate conversation, and groups would sit together and talk about the facts of climate change that are affecting Scotland. And once you've got that understanding of the facts, because many people don't have a full understanding, it was found that, well, the conversation changes. It stops being about sort of finger pointing and counter arguments and blaming one another. And it starts to be about, well, okay, we all recognize X is happening. What should we do about it? And then they say, well, what should the government do about it? And what should I do about it? And then it becomes sort of a collective move, because you've all recognized something. You can then move in the same direction. And so that's part of it. It's changing the conversations, the stories we tell each other about climate change, localizing them in the communities that we live in, and making the change real and effective that way. So that's one important way in which we can make a real meaningful difference. And then we, of course, make that difference as well and reflect that difference in our businesses and through our representatives, because they then have to reflect our demands and our wants as their citizens. And you said also, what about other groups and individuals? I mean, clearly young people understand this urgency. Now, oftentimes they get pushed aside, or they're just young people. They don't really understand the complexity. In this case, I don't buy that. I think young people, including Greta, who's amazing, have a clarity of thinking that we sometimes lack. I don't accuse you of that, of Henry, of course, but many people say we can't do that for the following reasons. But these young people are the next generation. They are going to have to live in the hellhole, the hothouse hellhole that we're about to create. And there's no surprise to me that they're demanding change, that they're saying enough's enough, that the latest major poll that just came out a couple of weeks ago found that almost 50% of young people 16 to 25 said that they felt a lot of anxiety and stress about the failure of governments to deal specifically with global warming and climate change. It doesn't surprise me, but it also gives me a little bit of hope, because it tells me that the next generation of leaders, of thinkers, of investors, managers, and entrepreneurs, those people will not tolerate it. So we need to listen to what they're saying and actually be energized by that. COP should look at what's happening and hear the youth's demand for action, hear your demand for action as a leading entrepreneur, Henry, and stand on those shoulders. Don't be timid as a politician. I think we can get there. I think many of the solutions exist, and we have amazing entrepreneurial ability, amazing market ability to deliver on those goals, to get to net zero or to get very much closer to it, and to ensure that we have a sustainable future for all of us going forward. So we need to be ambitious and make the leap, and not sort of pass everything, but actually make that stretch. Listen to young people, talk amongst ourselves as communities, support what you're doing, Henry, support what Mark Carney's doing, press the leaders to actually make the biggest commitments they can at COP26.
Well, Stuart, we cannot thank you enough for the time you've given us to speak to the FPA audience. There are times in history, and there are times in our lives in which we get called upon to exert leadership in an existential threat such as climate change. And you're one of those people who have heeded that call, who are devoting your time, your energy, your enthusiasm, your passion to help communities of business leaders, academicians, government officials, our membership here, think about these very important and timely issues that are not waiting or cannot wait for a new generation to tackle them. They have to be tackled immediately, and particularly like your emphasis in localizing and personalizing, these issues is not only about what can the government do or what can other businesses do, but what each of us can and should do, to address this process and this major threat. So on behalf of everyone at the Foreign Policy Association, I want to thank you again for this fascinating discussion. You certainly have given us a great deal to think about. And for those that want to read your book, as a reminder, it's called Climate Crisis Economics. And I saw a blurb there in a search that I did that you have mentioned that the book is now in paperback. So it's even more affordable, more easier to read, given the language and the style of engaging that you do. So please, everyone have an opportunity to see that. So thank you again, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, Henry. It's been a pleasure. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.